While there are quite a few contenders, Final Fantasy is my favorite video game series of all time. There is nothing that I've played that quite captures the magic of these stories, with the integration of music, narrative beats, themes, drama, characters, and emotions just presenting this form of narrative that is so much more than the sum of its parts. And while you can pinpoint parts of the series' history where the storytelling style shifted, I still think there's a coherent and consistent underlying magic that has been and continues to be emblematic of Final Fantasy. While the plots and themes and ideas change, I still believe that the soul of these games and what Final Fantasy is continues to be captured more than adequately to this day. Which brings me to today's topic, where I will be giving you my full ranking of the Final Fantasy games, from least favorite to favorite. Just a couple of things to get out of the way first, however. This list can obviously only include the games that I've played, and those include Final Fantasies 4, 5, 6, 7, Crisis Core, 7 Remake, 8, 9, 10, 12, Tactics, 14, 15, and Strangers of Paradise. Anything not listed is one that I haven't played and obviously can't rank, although hopefully I'll be able to give them a try sometime in the future. And last thing to clarify, I need to stress that I don't think any of these games are bad at all. Even the lowest ones in this list are still ones that I enjoy, and to this day I haven't played a Final Fantasy game that isn't at least solid. Number 14, Strangers of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. I finished Strangers of Paradise early in 2022 after checking it out due to the hilariously memeable trailers, and while I got the amazing humor that I wanted from the experience, what I didn't expect was a surprisingly fitting and cool origin story of sorts dating back all the way to the beginning of the series. The conclusion is pretty damn electrifying as things click into place, and they definitely nail the scope and importance of all that occurs while not undercutting its tonal identity. This one has a low ceiling due to a lack of interesting characters and emotional investment, but it was a thoroughly entertaining experience that ended up being quite a bit more than I expected it to be. Number 13, Final Fantasy V. Funnily enough, I honestly don't see any significant flaws with Final Fantasy V. I think it's one of the better designed Final Fantasy games in terms of gameplay, with a fantastic job system and a level curve that, from what I remember, is essentially close to mathematical perfection. It is mechanically polished and it's a consistently fun experience. However, the thing that holds it back for me is that it isn't really my type of game. I play games primarily for the stories, and the narrative just wasn't the focus for 5, in my opinion. The music is great as always, Exdeath is a solid antagonist, and the cast is decent enough, but this just isn't really a story-focused game, containing a clever but pretty bare-bones plot and a narrative that makes way for the main draw, which is the gameplay. And that's fine, but it just means that this one won't ever really connect with me as much as some of the others. Number 12, Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV was my second ever Final Fantasy, and it sticks out to me as the game most representative of the series. When I hear the main musical theme for the franchise, this is the first game that comes to mind, and outside of nostalgia, I think that's because it's an awesome mix of classic and iconic, and revolutionary in terms of concept. This game was one of the first of its kind, intending to genuinely tell a proper, sprawling, and rich narrative, and so it has all the classic Final Fantasy elements at their most traditional. The crystals, the biomes, the warriors fighting to save the world, but it also takes things in different and ambitious directions. The experience is muddled a bit by some stagnant arcs and a couple of annoying fake-out deaths, and the flow and pacing can be hit or miss, but this is a classic for a reason. Cecil and Kain are awesome characters, and the importance of this game in the scope of the series cannot be overstated, as it was the kicking off point for the more complex and emotional stories that were to follow. However, I tend to be an evolution over revolution person when it comes to games, as concepts introduced through these monumental breakthroughs are polished and expanded upon. I like Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess more than Ocarina of Time, for instance, and I like Super Mario Galaxy more than Super Mario 64, etc. And here is a similar case. I'm so appreciative of 4 for what it manages to do and how it changed history. But while it's a good game, I just think that subsequent entries were able to provide better overall experiences with more polish and quality. Number 11, Final Fantasy XV. It really pains me to put Final Fantasy XV this low, because I do really enjoy it, and it's provided me with some of my favorite moments in the entire series. Noctis is a great protagonist, the music is a fantastic alternative take from the wonderful Yoko Shimomura, the bonds between the four boys are absolutely magical and so emotionally engaging, and that ending brought me to tears. But unfortunately, this is probably the most flawed mainline game, in interesting contrast to the pure stylistic differences I have with 5. Outside of the main four and Arden, this cast definitely leaves a decent bit to be desired. The overworld could have been more rich, and a few big story beats could have been executed to a greater potential and with more quality. But my main problem with the game is that the story, especially upon release, poorly explains or leaves out some vital context that is kind of essential to the experience. They have since corrected some of this through subsequent story patches over time, along with extra context through expansions, ancillary material, and some anime stuff. But having to bend over backwards through other mediums to simply enjoy the story to its fullest makes it an uneven and ultimately scattered experience. However, despite that, I have primarily fond memories of 15, and it'll always have a strong presence in my heart. Number 10. Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Crisis Core is a messy one, and I can definitely see some not being able to relate to me putting it even this high. It's pretty undeniable that some of the character work is questionable at best given the weight of the material it covers, and I can't say that I ever really bought into the combat system much. However, the main thing that elevates this game for me revolves around one element: the protagonist, Zack Fair. Zack is a top 5 Final Fantasy protagonist for me, and one of my favorite ever, striking this amazing mix between extremely likable, heroic, thematically potent, and emotionally engaging. And it is primarily thanks to him that I consider this game to be flawed but good rather than a huge disappointment. Everything revolves around him, and he was the one aspect that they needed to nail. And luckily, they nailed him. The voice work is excellent, at least in the original, I haven't played Reunion, and his journey is a consistently engaging one with some of the most emotional sequences in video games for me, particularly that ending. Zack Fair is an unforgettable protagonist both alone and for his dynamics with the likes of Aerith and Cloud, and as a result, the positives definitely outweigh the negatives when it comes to Crisis Core. Number 9. Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII is where we start getting into the entries that I think are extremely good. This one has so much to like, with so many departures and brand new elements, but without it feeling like it isn't grounded in the same series. Hitoshi Sakamoto took the reins as composer for this, and his soundtrack is awesome, opting for ambience, atmosphere, and mood more than catchiness to great effect for this type of game. This is arguably the Final Fantasy with the most extensive world building outside of 14, with a great setting and awesome political maneuvering all over the place. It has a fantastic localization and a protagonistic cast containing some of the more layered characters in the series, with Ash being the standout and one of my favorites in the franchise, but with the likes of Balthier and Bosch being great too. The plot is excessively political, which may not appeal to some, and the combat has much more of an MMO spin to it which may be jarring, but the execution of both of these aspects is good, and only a lack of emotional connection and the game kind of running out of steam towards the end stop this one from being higher. Number 8. Final Fantasy VIII. Now we're getting into my favorites, and this is somewhat of a contentious one. Chronologically sandwiched in between two of the most beloved entries, Final Fantasy VIII is undoubtedly limited by some negatives in both gameplay and story, but at the same time it is so easy to love. It has a soundtrack that is, in my opinion, in the conversation for the best in the series, a surprisingly sound plot given how complex it can be, some great theming, and a varied and very solid cast with a couple of standouts in Squall, who remains underrated, and Laguna, who is deservedly pretty universally loved. Largely dependent on the music, there is something deeply soothing and nostalgic about the vibes of 8, just through casually traversing the overworld, or Balamb Garden, or Fisherman's Horizon. This is in many ways a dark world and story, but it manages to capture this really entrancing atmosphere that just draws you in and makes you lose yourself. Squall's journey is far more nuanced than people give it credit for, and despite some very clear silliness and flaws, it is such a joy to get lost in this world and invest in this journey of these kids who just wish to be kids. Number 7. Final Fantasy Tactics. Understandably the least Final Fantasy on this list, this labor of love from director Yasumi Matsuno is a fantastic game. Final Fantasy Tactics ushers you into the dense political landscape of Ivalice, into a story that does admittedly lack a lot of the classic whimsy characteristic of the series, but it makes up for it with an immensely interesting narrative full of betrayal, war, magic, and some of the most beautiful character arcs in the series. This is a Game of Thrones-esque political narrative full of intrigue, moral ambiguity, and a vast array of personalities all invested in the outcome of this struggle for power, using any means at their disposal to grasp it. But despite the dense focus on themes involving cycles of power, the nature of history, and more cerebral stuff, there is genuine heart throughout, provided primarily through the amazing dynamic between Ramza and Delita, two of the standout characters in the series. The gameplay can be a bit of a barrier for entry for some, and it definitely was for me, but if you can clear that hurdle, then you'll be rewarded with one of the very best JRPG stories out there. Number 6. Final Fantasy VII. Some will probably be surprised that this one is number 6, as it is one of the most beloved games of all time, and I tend to at least see it at number 3 or so for most Final Fantasy lists. But as should be clear given the way I've talked about the game so far, this is the furthest thing from a knock on 7. I just happen to love 5 other games a bit more. I do think that 7 is more flawed than people tend to talk about, with some uneven character work and a localization that unfortunately falls short in a bunch of ways, diluting some scenes and characters in the process. But in spite of that, this is without doubt a borderline masterpiece and an iconic classic for good reason. It contains what is perhaps Nobuo Uematsu's best soundtrack in the series, some marvelous theming and world-building integration, and one of the absolute best plots in gaming history, as it gradually unfolds before us over time in such a captivating and effective way. To this day, this game has one of the best introductions I've played. Shinra are awesome as an antagonistic corporation, and the way that the Lifestream integrates with so many characters and encapsulates so much of what the story is saying is breathtaking. And that's not to mention Sephiroth, whose iteration in the original game is one of the best examples of a minimalistic approach to sell a monumental villain. Final Fantasy VII is amazing, and without doubt one of my favorite games of all time. Number 5. Final Fantasy X. I kept going back and forth in deciding between numbers 5 and 6, but sneaking in just ahead of 7 by a hair is Final Fantasy X. This was the series' first foray into voice acting and presenting and executing properly rendered CG environments, and so naturally it is a bit rough around the edges in both departments, with the voice acting problems being a result of program restraints more than anything else. However, everything else about this game is pure magic and brilliance. While I wouldn't say that any of these characters are among the very best in the series, the cast is extremely good across the board, with pretty much every notable character having some sort of significant contribution. This one boasts one of the best soundtracks in the series as well, but what really elevates this game is the magic captured in the unique tragedy of the setting and how it integrates with the plot and themes. Spira is one of the best video game settings ever, and the way it impacts the psychology of the populace and the way that Tidus counteracts that is marvelous. This world is a spiral of despair, and every moment of beauty is laced with sadness and grief. And so that is why breaking out of it is so essential and empowering. But the story emphasizes that putting an end to this is excruciatingly difficult, and this is nailed home through one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking ends to a video game that I've ever experienced. Final Fantasy X is timeless, and my thoughts always seem to drift back to it. Number 4. Final Fantasy VII Remake. When I first heard that Final Fantasy VII would be getting an overhaul, I was extremely excited because of the potential ways in which this could elevate the messy script and enrich the cast. What I didn't expect was for it to completely expand upon the narrative, setting, and characters in a way that gave me a whole new emotional appreciation for the story. To date, the longest video that I've ever uploaded on this channel is my 200-minute comparison between Final Fantasy VII Remake and the original, so that should illustrate how passionate I am about it. But even still, words somehow still fail to communicate how I feel about this game. While the pacing and structure of the plot isn't great at times, and while some scenes are diluted and lacking in comparison to the greatness of the source, this story not only stays loyal to the soul of the original, but pulls off a creative masterstroke through making this a sequel that opens the door to a ton of potential possibilities that I don't believe will ever undercut 7. The voice acting in both Japanese and English is spectacular, and the soundtrack is a masterful reimagining of the original that pays homage without emulating, putting its own spin on it through variations and additional themes. The characters are heavily improved and executed beautifully, and Midgar as a setting is fully fleshed out and explored wonderfully. The finale is definitely jarring, but I've grown to absolutely love what it does to set up future parts. And yes, there is the caveat that the rest of the remake trilogy could stumble, but I've been given no reason to not have full confidence. I've said before that the completed remake series could potentially become my favorite game of all time, and I still believe that to be very possible. Number 3. Final Fantasy VI. This is the first Final Fantasy I ever played, and to this day it absolutely remains a strong favorite. It's essentially universally lauded as one of the best in the series and one of the most timeless and classic games of all time, along with the likes of its successor and Chrono Trigger. And that's with great reason, as it deserves every bit of acclaim it gets. Final Fantasy VI is the quintessential video game character piece, even if a lot of that is done through abstraction. While the setting is immersive, the plot does the job, and the themes are brilliantly executed, this one lives and dies by its ensemble cast. And while there are a couple that just aren't fleshed out much at all, the amount of variance, depth, and quality among the substantial roster is really impressive. With Terra, Celeste, Locke, Cyan, Shadow, Edgar, and a couple more being some of the most memorable across the franchise. Gameplay is polished and fluid, the pixel art is some of the best in history, and the music is absolutely breathtaking. From the dreary and grim to the soothing to the internal narrative and music form that is Dancing Mad. And speaking of Dancing Mad, 6 contains the best antagonist I've experienced in the series so far, outside of a certain character from 14. Kefka is unbelievable in so many ways, again through a lot of abstraction. The perfect thematic antithesis, and yet so interesting and engaging and lonely throughout, which makes the finale of the story powerful and emotional as all hell, as it nails home the essentiality of connection. This game is legendary, and it will stay with me for the rest of my life. Number 2. Final Fantasy IX. This game isn't perfect, and I can totally sympathize with and relate to some who found the combat frustratingly slow, because it is frustratingly slow at times. But even given this, it was not particularly hard to decide on this one as my number 2. By my reckoning, this is the second or third strongest cast of characters in the series, with my second favorite non-MMO mainline villain in Kuja, who is a phenomenally and ironically human foil, and 2 of my favorite video game characters of all time in the masterful Zidane and Vivi. Outside of that, the soundtrack is another that is in the conversation for Uematsu's best, and the background art that makes up the landscapes is at its series' best here. Like 14, 9 is in itself almost like a celebration of Final Fantasy, very much a return to roots after the last couple of previous entries went in bold directions. There are references all over the place to ground it, but it also just represents everything that is magical about Final Fantasy storytelling in the best way possible. The layered characters, the engaging plot, the amazing theme presentation, and one of the most fleshed out settings in the series. But most of all, it has such heart and soul, and some of the storybook-style uses of presentation help to make it so comfy and immersive. It has darkness, joy, wit, and charm, tragedy, tears of both laughter and sadness, and it contains so many storytelling set pieces that are so rent-free in my mind. Every character plays a great role, and every element is so baked into the design such that removing one would destroy the tapestry. It makes you think, it captures your imagination and heart, and overall it's just everything that's great about the series elevated to the nth degree. Number 1. Final Fantasy XIV. I really can't believe I'm saying this, but Final Fantasy XIV is my favorite Final Fantasy of all time, and probably my current favorite video game of all time. Being an MMORPG that's been firing on all cylinders for years and years, Final Fantasy XIV is an absolute monster of an investment. It starts out slower, some would say even badly, with a glaring lack of quality character writing, some bizarre structuring, and a huge emphasis on world dynamics. But carried by its dialogue, the interesting premise and world, and Soken's beautiful score, the story slowly but surely cements itself as a masterful one as you make your way through the expansions. And then from Shadowbringers and on, it is straight up in the conversation for the best Final Fantasy story of all time. It is a celebration of storytelling and the series itself that isn't too derivative, full of pathos, amazing characters, great theming, the best localization and dialogue in the series, and some ingenious storytelling. The gameplay is so rich and varied, the customizations are so fun to play around with for anyone who's into that sort of thing, and the community formed around this game definitely enhances the experience a ton. I've streamed myself playing through some of the biggest sections of the story and found it to be a transcendent experience. I was intimidated to try this one, but holy shit am I glad that I did. And I can't wait to keep following it in the years to come to see what the brilliant minds behind it will have in store for what is without doubt the best cast in the series. This is a title well worthy of the #1 spot. It just builds on itself in magnificent ways, it recontextualizes things, it captures your imagination and mind, and the scope and mythos and scale of everything it does blows my mind. If you're in the position I was, being a huge fan of Final Fantasy but not really knowing how to dip your toes into this one or if you even should, give it a go. Be patient through the first expansion, and I'm sure you'll be rewarded. It is Final Fantasy through and through, and in my opinion, it is the best version of Final Fantasy. And there we are, guys. This is my current ranking of every Final Fantasy game I've played. And while it won't age well due to upcoming releases of both 16 and 7 Rebirth, along with my continued playthrough of 14, I'm confident about basically every placing here right now. I know there are a couple of hot takes in there, so feel free to let me know what you think, along with your list as well. I'd love to see some other opinions. I very much appreciate your time, and as always, many thanks for watching.